Welcome, everyone. What a crowd on a beautiful spring evening in Ridgefield. What a thrill to see so many friends of the library, of the Ridgefield Historical Society, of the Garden Club gathered in this collaborative event with a wonderful author who, I'm told, the book came out today. How exciting. Maneuver, the development director for the Ridgefield Library. I see many friendly faces in the room. It's spring in Ridgefield, so there's a lot going on. Thank you for supporting the nonprofits that you are here to support, including the library. We have our gala coming up, and you'll hear about the garden tour coming up. And we just thank you because none of our wonderful community spirit could be possible without the support of our donors. This program and all the other programs that the library offers year-round, there are 1,500 different programs, are made possible by the generous support of people in our community. So thank you for that. We are so glad to be here with the Ridgefield Garden Club, the Historical Society, collaborators with us for many years on programs that bring joy to people in our community. And there's info in the back about the garden tour. Thank you, Books on the Common, our beloved bookstore, stalwart bookseller. Thank you for being here, Shira and Ella. Shop local, everyone. And how happy are we to welcome Todd Forrest, the Arthur Ross Vice President for Horticulture and Living Collections at the New York Botanical Garden, where he leads all programs and activities of the Garden's Horticulture and Living Collections Division, including the gardens, the grounds, the exhibitions, community horticulture initiatives, and a staff of approximately 80 managers, curators, and horticulturists. Mr. Forrest came to the New York Botanical Garden in 1998 as a research assistant in the Institute of Economic Botany. He joined the horticulture staff as curator of woody plants in 1999 and became vice president in 2005. Mr. Forrest received his Master of Forest Science degree from Yale University's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Thank you, Todd. Welcome. Enjoy the evening.
Hi, everybody. All right, here we are. Thank you, Jane and Lucy from the Ridgefield Public Library, and thank you, it's the indomitable Shira Perkis, who's managing book sales for Books on the Common. There are several big shots from the Ridgefield Historical Society here, including the chairman, and of course the folks from the Ridgefield Garden Club, who are putting together two pretty amazing events in June. I think June 7th is a soiree and June 8th is a garden tour. You know, it's pretty remarkable to live in a town that has that concentration of interesting people doing cool things for the benefit of their community. Speaking of interesting people doing cool things for the benefit of the community, I wanted to thank you all for showing up. I'm sure everybody in this room had better things to do. I appreciate whoever it was who convinced you that this was worth taking your time to do. And I mostly want to give props to two people. It's his birthday today. At this time. And then my beautiful bride, Allison Pratt, who is the reason why you were all here. AP, thank you. All right, well, here we are. So I do a lot of talks on various subjects. Most of them have something to do with gardening in an elevated and inspired way, both for horticultural purposes, but also for purposes of supporting and sustaining the nature that supports and sustains us. This talk is based on the content of the book, which in many ways is my letter of gratitude to the New York Botanical Garden, where I have worked for 27 years in June. It will be 27 years. So why are you here to listen to me? It's an excellent question. Who am I? An even better question. So let me try to sort of establish context. The person in the red raincoat in that wonderful Douglas fir rainforest in the Pacific Northwest the ears that extend far beyond the hat, is me. And I grew up in suburban New Jersey, a bit of a nature boy. And so I came into gardening via nature and not the other way. But when I got into gardening, I got into it in a pretty profound way, and me looking prim and proper in one of the exhibitions that we had at the New York Botanical Garden, where my role as head of horticulture, I oversee the team who takes care of our 250-acre National Historic Landmark landscape. We have a wonderful program called Bronx Greenup, which works throughout the borough of the Bronx to support community gardens and urban farmers in their work. And then we have a 50-acre old growth forest at the heart of the garden, and we have a program of ecological restoration. So those duties combined are my role. So I have a pretty unusual perspective on the interrelationship between gardening and nature. And it's one that has grown over my long career at the New York Botanical Garden and prior at other institutions, including retail nurseries. And there's no better place to learn the importance of plants in people's lives than selling plants at a retail nursery. One time, I was able to load an entire pallet of recently watered sod into the back of a Honda Civic. So for those of you, show of hands, who's been to NYBG? Oh, look at this crowd. I like this crowd in the northern Bronx. You know all of that. But you might not know a lot about the origin story of the garden. And really this talk, which again is based on the book, is about kind of weaving a narrative about this institution and this place over time, and how this very 19th century institution that was created with the lofty ideals of that era actually has a lot to teach modern people who are concerned about the environment and nature. And that horticulture, that gardening, traditional gardening, also has a lot to teach us about human relationship with nature. And it is my hope that one gardener at a time, that we will together save the world. That might be slightly overambitious, but if you don't have goals, then you won't achieve them. So, the garden as an institution were founded by these fine people, Nathaniel Britton, who was a geologist and kind of general natural history guy from Columbia, and his wife, Elizabeth Britton. And the story goes, in the late 1880s, they visited the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in London, and they came back to New York City believing that not only did New York need a Kew, but America needed a Kew. And so, at that same time, in the second half of the 19th century, was a really exciting time in New York City. It was the era of the creation of great cultural institutions. Of course, the first was the American Museum of Natural History in 1869, then the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1870, and NYBG was the third of those great cultural institutions, created as an institution in 1891. And so the Britons came back, and they wanted to create this institution, and they wanted it to be a lot like these European antecedents, like the Jardin des Plantes and Kew and others throughout the European capitals, as an institution that would pursue a three-part mission of botanical science, education at every level from preschooler through PhD, and of course horticulture. But these were Americans in New York City in the late 19th century, and there were a lot of other things that were happening in New York at that time, in America at the time. That was, at the tail end of transcendentalism, there was a growing interest in the role that nature plays in sustaining the human spirit, educating the human mind. And so these kind of ideas, these values, these mores were all bouncing around their heads as they went to create the institution. So was a growing understanding of sophisticated landscape design. How many of you have heard of Capability Brown? Okay, of course, Shira, the red back of the back. So a wonderful 18th century landscape architect in England, and one of three people who were famous for creating the picturesque landscape that really is what English landscape architecture is known for. It's its contribution to the world. The crazy thing about these landscapes, this is Petworth, one of the great landscapes that was created by Brown, is that they were completely artificial. It was a series of old kind of denuded farm fields, maybe little bits and pieces of forest that had been left over. If there were rural areas, it might be larger. And so that lake was not a normal lake. It was all excavated, and the fill was used to create the hills. Literally, these were gardens that were created to look like Virgil's poems, made people feel. Wonderful, nature-informed, nature-inspired, but not natural. Of course, maybe the most famous American landscape inspired by those gardens and by that kind of gardening approach to gardening is Central Park, which was created in the middle of the 19th century. Again, to be the green space in the heart of New York, which is growing very, very rapidly at that time. And this is the Greensward plan from Olmsted and Vaux that is to this day hanging in the arsenal, which is the building in Central Park. And it's hailed as the most kind of influential and important bit of landscape design in American history. And again, very much rooted in that English tradition. So that was the middle of the 19th century. In the late 19th century, as this institution was being conceived, at the same time, so you have the cultural institution movement, you have this kind of tail end of transcendentalism, and then you have the parks movement. So Central Park was very successful. New York's kind of leaders thought at the time that as the city was growing, they better set aside more open space in adjacent areas because parks make cities livable. And so in 1884, the New Parks Act was passed. It set aside about 3,500 acres of land in what was then partially Westchester County, but ultimately became the Bronx. And so this is the largest, to this day, the Bronx is the greenest of the boroughs in New York City. And this is very much inspired by the Emerald Necklace. Have you all been to the Emerald Necklace in Boston? So a connected string of parks running from Van Cortlandt Park in the northwest, down the Moxley Parkway, Bronx Park, the northern half of which is NYBG, the southern half of which is the Wildlife Conservation Society or the Bronx Zoo, out the Pelham Parkway, Pelham Bay Park. A pretty amazing kind of civic act to basically purchase this land, mostly through eminent domain, and set it aside for the benefit of all New Yorkers. So these are the values that were percolating in the heads of the people who created this institution. It was based on European models. It was meant to create this educational experience and a research experience that would elevate the human mind, but it was also meant to engage and inspire the body by giving people the opportunity to go outdoors in a beautiful place. So the particular part of Bronx Park that was set aside for the New York, that ultimately became the home for the garden, was described by a man named John Mullally in a book called New Parks Beyond the Harlem that was published in 1887. Now, a note about John Mullally is that there used to be a Mullally Park in New York City named after him. He was really a visionary and a tremendous advocate for creation of green space. He was also a horrible racist. And so I file John Mullally under the even bad people can have good ideas. And he did have great ideas about setting aside all this parkland. And I love what he wrote in this very 19th century language about the landscape that ultimately became the New York Botanical Garden. So I'll read it, just in case you guys are like me in the back and you can't read things. It would be difficult to do justice to the exquisite loveliness of the tract, without seeming to exaggerate. For the character of the scenery is so varied that every step is a surprise, and the artist and the wayfaring man might love to linger there. And another one, I think even more powerful and more modern in a way, it's a place where children can learn without studying, acquire knowledge without opening a book, and where they can be levied a tax of profit from their varied play. The idea that spending time outside is good for human development, and that spending time in a magical, mysterious, kind of natural landscape, I guess nothing like which existed in Europe at the time, even better. This is the landscape they chose for the home of the garden. It was one of the 3 sites that the garden as an institution was offered when it was incorporated in 1891. The first act of the institution was raising money, because in the act of incorporation was the demand that the institution raise $250,000, about $9 million in current money, in order to establish its own programs and collections, and it took them 4 years to do that. So founded in 1891, the site was chosen in 1895, and of the 3 sites that Britain looked at, the site that we are on called out to him. For what I hope are obvious reasons, just looking at these pictures from the era. At its heart, it's a 50-acre old-growth forest that was considered to be a miracle of nature, of remnant nature in the 19th century. Its preservation was an accident of ownership over a very long period of time. That around the heart of that forest, the kernel of that forest, were a series of old farm fields and pastures, and everybody who lives in and around Ridgefield can see this. An abandoned farm, beautiful old crumbling stone wall, maybe an old hayfield that hasn't been mowed, and maybe an oak or a maple or a tulip tree that had been left to kind of grow, and maybe it had shaded sheep or cows or whatever in the past. That was the natural, that was the canvas upon which the NYBG was painted. And it was, again, as a space, considered to be miraculously beautiful at the time, in the late 19th century. So they ended up creating a very traditional 19th century botanical garden, and they allocated a certain amount of land across the 250 acres for a certain amount of institutional purposes. The collections, we are a museum of plants, about half the space, natural areas, about 85 acres, and then decorative grounds, more formal gardens, horticultural kind of conceits, mostly around the areas that would be where the buildings would be. And so here you can see what was then called the Hemlock Road. The forest was called the Hemlock Road. More about that later. And then you can see the Bronx River, which flows its way through the landscape. Preserving this miraculous bit of nature in the middle of this institution that was devoted to cultivating plants for the betterment of the people, all within the expanding city. So, I'm a little competitive, really across every aspect of my life. And I've become, over my professional life, very competitive on behalf of the New York Botanical Garden. So I apologize if I come off as a shill. I am a shill. And a lot of what I wrote in the book, and a lot of it sort of lives in my brain all the time, are arguments with other people who are actually not having an argument with me. And one of the arguments that I used to hear early in my career when I was a sort of puppy, eager curator of trees at the garden was, well, the garden is very beautiful and all, but it's not like Central Park. It doesn't have that single person's brilliant vision of the landscape. It's not a painting across the earth. It's nice and all, but it's no Central Park. This is from 1897. I too will read this from Garden and Forest, which is a wonderful publication that was created by Charles Sprague Sargent, who is the founder of the Arnold Arboretum, where I got my career started. It's Harvard's Arboretum in Boston. So no city in the world possesses more beautiful scenery or a park area more thoroughly characteristic of what is most delightful in the landscape of that part of the world in which it is situated than does New York and Bronx Park. The city spent money like water to create some charming natural scenery in what is now Central Park by blasting out ridges of rock, filling in spaces with soil, and turning this desert of stone into a tree-flecked meadowland. Now that it has come into possession of scenery far more beautiful and ready-made, it would be folly to destroy it. So what he's saying is that Central Park was a wonderful act of artifice. The natural landscape of this institution was literally incomparable. There was no other place like it in any city in the world, and the garden had better not screw it up. This was in response to the original idea of where the conservatory was to be located. It was originally supposed to be here, which is now the current site of our rock garden. And Sargent and others felt that it was too close to the library building, and it would create kind of big clusters of crowds. And so he advocated to move it there, which is ultimately where it ended up. So he was successful, both in dissing, throwing shade on Central Park, and also getting the garden better. And in case you're wondering, was it hyperbole? Was he exaggerating? This is a painting of Central Park, of the land that became Central Park before Central Park was designed. What was the phrase? This desert of stone. Nice, but it was not the most beautiful natural landscape in the world. Nothing but potential. Here's a painting of the garden from about the same time. The landscape that became the garden. The early Hudson River School painting by William Witherby Miller. The most delightful bit of nature that you can imagine. So there's Central Park. And so again, once they had that kind of the site chosen, then now you've chosen the site because of its nature, you better not screw it up. And so there's a lot of early writing by Britton and others as they were laying out the garden that they were to do everything they could to not negatively interfere or impact the beauty, the natural beauty of the site, including laying out the road. So you see all those big trees there as the roads are being laid out. Those were the pre-existing trees. Outside the forest, there were thousands upon thousands of mature oaks and tulip trees and sweet gums. It was pretty remarkable. And they made every effort to not cut them down, moving the roads around, moving the collections around so they would fall in place. These are not best practices. If you have a big, beautiful tree in your yard, please do not put the road right up next to it and pile the rubble on the roots as you make the construction. Anyway, but the idea, the spirit behind the work was there. And then in terms of the layout of the living collections, again, the idea was no formal beds, no Victorian-era bedding out schemes, that the collections themselves should settle into the landscape in a way that was respectful to the nature of the site. So this is an early planting in the Pinetum, or now it's called the Conifer Arboretum, a collection of conifers. It's our museum collection of plants. And you can see the little baby pines here, but you can see those little baby pines planted basically in what is a copse, a clearing in the forest, almost a savanna. All those other big trees are all native trees that have been saved during the design and construction of the institution. So that's an extraordinary gift. That was an intentional set of decisions made in the late 19th century, and it's one that those of us who know the garden and get to experience the garden benefit from every day that we were at the garden. So I want to sort of go through in the rest of this talk how we, in the current time, have tried to be true to that historic respect for the nature of the site, while also being true to the history of horticulture across the site. Over my 27-year career at the garden, we've restored about 150 of the garden's 250 acres, all the while trying to be sensitive to nature, sensitive to our predecessors, while continuously elevating the art and science of gardening, of horticulture, for the benefit of our visitors. And so I'm going to do that through a series of landscapes and a series of features that I feel best represent that sort of ethos. And I wanted to give a shout out to my collaborator in the book, Larry Lederman, who was a trustee of the garden for a long time. He was a very successful mergers and acquisitions attorney. He quasi-retired from that, bought a camera, and just started taking pictures of trees at the garden and taking classes at the garden. And so he has a very deep connection to the place. And he's forever pestering me about writing new books with him. This is the third book I've done in collaboration with him. But what I love about Larry is he's not trained as a photographer. He just has the sort of innocent eye of someone who's beholding nature for the first time and can afford really, really nice cameras. And so it's a magical combination. So the areas we're going to look at, of course, are the Thain Family Forest, that old-growth forest, which is the primary reason the garden was established on its site. Daffodil Hill, which might feel kind of directly in conflict with the concept of gardening nature. I'll try to explain that. The rock garden, which also might feel directly in conflict. The azalea garden, which opened in 2011. The native plant garden, which opened in 2013. And our trees, back to this thought of these preservation of these trees being maybe one of the most rewarding gardening of nature decisions made in the 19th century. So first, the Thain Family Forest. Here you get the setting. I love this picture. We have a staff photographer who got a drone, and we have lots and lots and lots of drone pictures, which are really interesting to see, but they don't really translate into the way of the human eye. No human eye has ever had this perspective, unless you were sort of hang gliding over the forest. But you can see Manhattan off in the distance as a view looking south. And if you look closely, you can pick out the conservatory, you can pick out maybe some of the spaces, but from an eagle's eye view or an owl's eye view, our land is a forest, which is sort of amazing. And the heart of our landscape is a forest. This quote is from the Olmsted brothers, who were Frederick Olmsted's son and nephew, who he later adopted, who came to NYBG in the 1920s to do a master plan. Anybody who works in a landscape or a historic building spends a lot of time doing master plans and try to figure out how to make the thing work today without screwing it up too much. And so we probably had 15 master plans of the garden's 130-year history. But the Olmsted one, after the original design from the 1890s, is probably the one that's had the most lasting impact on the landscape. And they, of course, like everybody before them and everybody since, fell in love with the forest. And in the early days of the garden, the best practices for an old-growth forest were to do nothing. Basically, the principle was, the only thing we can do is screw this up. Mother Nature knows best. There's a lot of religion in there. There's a lot of just kind of, again, transcendental kind of separation of people and nature. And that was the best science at the time. So they spent many, many, many years making sure that no one did anything within the forest that might somehow diminish its primeval character. It was called the hemlock grove because it was dominated by mature hemlocks. It felt like a scale model of the coast redwood forest of California. Big old conifer trees, but already, even before 1609, the hemlocks were a little bit in a tough spot because this was a relic of a post-glacial forest, and as the planet was warming after glaciation ended about 18,000 years ago, hemlocks were receding north along with the glaciers. So it was a weird little pocket of hemlocks, mostly because they were growing along the pool ravine of the Bronx River. So hemlocks were already starting to struggle as early as the early 1900s. And so they did some science, some research, and they thought that maybe the reason why there were no baby hemlocks is because all the old hemlocks were so big and the shade they cast was so dense that no baby hemlock could grow, possibly grow in those conditions. Well, they compared our forest to other forests in more rural areas, and there were plenty of little baby hemlocks and old-growth hemlock forests in Massachusetts and Connecticut and upstate New York. Ultimately, they concluded that what was not allowing the hemlocks to succeed was that people were trampling them. You can imagine, put yourself in New York City in 1899 or 1902 or 1904. The summers were just as brutal as they are now, maybe not just as brutal, but maybe worse, because think of all the air pollution kind of going up. People would crowd into this space in the depth of summer in order just to get some relief from the relentless humidity and heat. And in doing so, they didn't realize that they were doing harm. They were literally compacting the soil and crushing the old hemlocks. And so the garden started to think, oh, we should do something. So they put out signs like the one here. They also lobbied the Parks Department in order to be allowed to put fences along the trails. A note about that, like the Met, like AMNH, like the zoo, New York City not-for-profits, the big cultural institutions, are public-private partnerships. We are private institutions, but our land and our buildings are owned by the city. And so early on, you'd have to negotiate with the city if you want to make any changes. Fortunately, that has changed. It's still owned by the city, but we have the freedom and flexibility to manage it to our best of our abilities. But then, it was a very active dialogue in the city, believing that only any intervention would diminish the forest, really pushed against anything. And ultimately, we prevailed because we could show them through science that the impact of people wandering off trails was devastating to the health of the forest. The next thing, and this is really about this amazing woman, Elizabeth Britton, who was the co-founder of the institution. The garden was created by botanists. Botanists are inveterate catalogers. They just want to know what's around them, and they write it down and take herbarium specimens, and they just were always aware of what's around them. So the first thing they did, when they took this land, is they cataloged all of the spontaneous native and non-native species that grew there. And they found an extraordinary diversity of wildflowers. So that's the late 19th century. At the same time, there was a fashion, a little bit like the bird plumes and hats, for people to take wildflowers, dig them up out of the forest, and use them as, I don't know, boutonnieres, whatever people do, put them in their hair or whatever, as decoration. And so Elizabeth Britton saw this and saw this rapid decline in the diversity of the wildflowers growing on the site, and that ultimately inspired her to become arguably the first plant conservationist in history. But this particular picture is 410 jacks in the pulpit. We all know that one of them made a plant that Elizabeth Britton confiscated from a school group who had dug them out of the forest during a school visit. And there's very few jacks in the pulpit. To go from being able to dig up 400 in a matter of an hour or so with a bunch of kids to having none, you see how human impacts were really changing the forest. And of course, the forest is surrounded by a garden. And gardens are lovely, but gardens are also fertile ground for plants. And often those plants end up growing where they don't belong. This is long before the notion of invasive species had come out. And so we plant a lot of things in our collections because we're using plants. And over time, many of those things have invaded the forest. And in fact, many of those things have invaded the forest and taken up the growing space that had been abandoned by the loss of the native wildflowers in the space. So even though it's an old-growth forest, it's not pristine, and it's not undisturbed. And so here you have this thing that it's very kind of preservation, the leaving it alone, prevented us, at least in the early years, from doing the things we needed to do to preserve its health. And then fast forward to the 1980s, you guys have all heard of hemlock woolly adelgid. If you have a hemlock in Ridgefield, you probably have hemlock woolly adelgid. This blew into New York City on the winds of Hurricane Gloria in 1985, and it more or less finished off the remaining hemlocks in the forest. But the forest still remains. The hemlocks are mostly gone, but the forest is still dominated by native tree species, mostly oaks, but a range of other species. There are increasing populations of native wildflowers, and it gives me great hope for nature's ability to sort of rebound and respond to all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that we throw upon it. And what we're doing in the forest, we started in 2008, is a program of active ecological restoration. So the simple idea here is we're trying to undo the negative human, mitigate negative human influences that we can identify and that we can simply and relatively inexpensively mitigate. Those are primarily the removal of invasive species and the planting of native species grown from seed collected within the forest itself, or certainly regionally. We're using this to do a lot of things. One, to preserve and improve the health of the forest, but also to serve as an inspiration for other people who are doing this sort of work kind of regionally. And then, of course, in everything we do, there's an educational component. So we have school children coming through, all the way through graduate students, all learning about how it's possible to interact with nature in a way that benefits both nature and people. And so just a few photos of the forest today. This would make a German forester very upset, but kind of central to the health and well-being of the biota of the landscape are things like what's called coarse woody debris, a bunch of crap lying on the ground. That's fantastic habitat for a whole range of animals, and also, if you imagine, excuse me, a tree coming down. Oh, look at that. Oh, God. Thank you. Yeah. Say that this tree has grown for 175 years. That's about the average age of our oldest trees, and that's about how old those trees have ever gotten for a variety of reasons. Well, that's 175 years of bringing nutrients up from the soil, right? If that tree blows over in a hurricane or a windstorm and you remove it, you are now depriving the forest soil of those nutrients that it needs to recycle and regrow. So leaving coarse woody debris in a forest is very important, both from a habitat perspective and a forest health perspective. We have ephemeral pools, but as of yet, no spring peepers. So one of the subversive things I plan on doing before my career ends is to bring spring peepers back to the garden. It's a remarkable, as you look at these pictures, you realize it's hard to imagine that this is New York City. We have the wonderful reverse J-shaped distribution of trees, meaning classical growth forest. There are very few very large trees and lots of medium-sized trees and even more small trees. Because the forest has been allowed to more or less grow on its own, the tree falls, it creates a canopy gap, new trees come in, and that process has been repeating itself over and over and over again for millennia, for probably about 12,000 years. And the impact, the effect today, is a magical, multi-layered, dense forest that has some invasive species that we're managing them, but unlike most forests in this part of the world, it has a rich understory. Because what do we think that we don't have, that you have? Deer. Deer are forest biodiversity killers, they really are. And I'm grateful that we don't have them. We have a natural deer fence, which are highways and the city all around us. Every now and again, one of them swims down the Bronx River, and then everybody gets kind of panicked. And there's the Bronx River fall. Okay, so going from the forest to Daffodil Hill. How is Daffodil Hill gardening with nature, you might ask? Well, a little bit about its history. So when the garden was established, it was 250 acres, and then in 1915 we added another 150 acres, give or take, so we were 400 acres at our largest. And this was again in 1915, and it was a time, 20 years or so after the garden had been established, that some people were starting to clamor for a little more bloom. So we love all this nature, big glass building, we love all your science and your education, but where's the sort of, where are the posies? Where's the joyful, splashes of color that elevate and inspire? And very stern and serious Britain was like, no posies, and then went back and forth. And ultimately, there really wasn't room for them because much of the garden was filled up by the forest and the systematic collections. But when this land was added, in the southern part of the landscape, and I'm sorry, the map goes down, so this is north, this is south, all of a sudden there was some room to do some stuff. And so what they did was they created more formal gardens. Because that's what people were clamoring for. They wanted to see lots of irises, and they wanted to see lots of dahlias. They wanted to see lots of they want to see a rock garden and all of that. But if you look at that picture, these pictures, and were all installed, between about 1917 and about 1925, it looks completely out of character with the rest of the site, right, that I've shown you before. These were impositions. They were interesting. The rock garden is in the foreground. It was just a bunch of rocks that were kind of placed around a big rock outcrop that was there. And then the formal beds with the irises and all of that were nice enough because they had plants, but they felt very out of character. One of the people who led this charge was a volunteer expert on irises and narcissus named Ethel Ansel Peckham. And in the 1920s, she had the brilliant idea on this Daffodil Hill, which is now called, was called then, of just planting lots of daffodils. Not in any particular order, not in any particular arrangement, but to find as many as she could convince people to donate to the institution and plant them across the space. That's sort of interesting. This feels a little bit wilder, and it's not a whole lot of work. This is a whole lot of work. You have to edge all the beds, you have to replant, you have to go and all this. This is, you plant the damn daffodils and you walk away and you get daffodils. And it actually kind of aligns with that kind of picturesque nature of these open spaces, the old farm fields. Well, by 2013, 90 years after they were originally planted, we hadn't planted a daffodil on that site since probably about 1926. And there were a lot of daffodils left. And many of them, it turns out, were these wonderful heirloom varieties that are no longer really available in the trade, and they just had proven themselves by just persisting, by surviving over time, with nobody paying attention. No fertilization, no dividing, no selection. It was just the plants surviving over time. And my wonderful colleague, Kristen Schleider, pictured here, we decided on the eve of the garden's 125th anniversary, which we were going to celebrate in 2016, we would start the process of planting 1 million daffodils. We would preserve the historic daffodils that remain and use the color palette as an inspiration for adding 1 million more, which we weren't going to do all at once, but we're going to do over time. Unfortunately, Kristen, who kind of conceived this and did the original design, passed away with ALS tragically only a few years after it was established. This is a permanent reminder of her brilliance and her dedication to the institution. So the cool thing is, we got to use toys, and because we were planting about 100,000 daffodils a year, just don't try to do that by hand. We used basically what was a modified potato planter that you drive around in a little tractor, and it came from our bold people, Brett Becky's in Virginia, and it dropped 100,000 daffodils in the matter of a day and a half. We did that for a couple of years, and then we ran out of space for that. So now we hand transplant. And what we're hand transplanting are remaining heirloom daffodils. We want to preserve that germplasm, preserve those unique plants for time because they're proven winners over time. And so every year we'll go to one of the old patches, dig it up, divide it, and replant and respread it. And we'll do that day at a time. We've planted probably about 600,000 daffodils. Each of those daffodils turns into about 5 daffodils within 3 or 4 years. So we've added several million daffodils more into the time. And you can really see, it's really, really, really amazing. And right now is the time. The peak usually is at the 3rd week of April. And it is, as far as the eye can see, you can look up the old road as you go off to the distance. And as you stand there enveloped, it really is magical. Now daffodils are also quite wonderful after they're done flowering because best practices is to not cut them down until after their foliage has died down, which means that we don't cut the lawn until after the foliage has died down, usually by about July 4th, the end of June. And it's really beautiful with just the long grass that's concealing the remains of the daffodil foliage. And as you stare across this expansive space, it is the most sustainable spectacle that we can create. Daffodils don't have a lot of wildlife value. They're not great pollinator plants, it's just a fact. And so I wouldn't have a garden of just daffodils. We have a huge garden with so many other plants. But I also wouldn't feel badly about planting daffodils if you love daffodils. And one of the great principles, I think, of gardening with nature is to not be browbeaten into doing something that you feel like you should do, but instead, the process of doing something that you want to do, that you love doing, learn about how, by doing what you're doing, you can make things better. And that's the principle that we've applied to the work that we're doing at NYBG. All right, the next place that I want to feature is the Rock Garden, created in 1932 by this man, T.H. Everett, the most legendary head of horticulture in the history of NYBG, and maybe the most important horticulturist ever in America. He was not born in America, he was born in England, and he came over in the late 1920s to work at Untermeyer. Have you all been to Untermeyer in Yonkers?
Yeah.
It was an estate called Greystone. It was the estate of Samuel Untermeyer, who was a very successful attorney. And he had set out to make the most impressive private garden in America. And he was probably successful. Over the past 15 years, they've been trying to restore the remains of that garden, and it is worth going to see, including the Persian garden. It's pretty amazing. Most of that garden is long gone. But Everett was recruited from Kew, where he had studied horticulture, to work at the Untermeyer, and ultimately he came to work at NYBG. Now he, as a condition of his employment, he was in a strong negotiating stance. He said, I'll come work for you, but you have to give me the opportunity to build a rock garden the way I want to build a rock garden. Not that crappy pile of rocks that you have at the top of Daffodil Hill, but a real legit rock garden inspired by the rock gardening phase that had been started in England. His inspiration were Reginald Farrer and William Robinson, who wrote wonderful books about rock gardening. It is the most English of all gardening pastimes. It's persnickety, and you can grow all these crazy plants, and there's an attention to detail, and it's over the top. But it can be quite magical. Really, the idea of rock gardening in England was to grow alpine plants that were coming back from across the empire that wouldn't do well in normal garden situations. So it was like create some rocks, grow some alpine plants. We can't really grow alpine plants in the Bronx. Our climate is just not well suited for them. So he ultimately decided to make a garden of plants that look good with rocks, which is actually pretty awesome. So this is the site. You've all been to the rock garden. It's hard to imagine. But even with the rock garden, he chose the site in 1930 very carefully. You can see the big old trees that were preserved. There was a little kind of rivulet that ran through the middle of it. It's hard to see in this picture. There's a rock outcrop up here, and there's one over here. So he took this wonderful site and created a garden using rock that he found, just strewn about the landscape. Again, if you've been to NYBG, we have a lot of rocks. We have amazing geology, and so there was a lot of rocks just out there for the picking. Then he arranged them in a way what he called a natural rock garden style. One that would appear as if it had just grown on the site naturally, taking advantage of topography, taking advantage of the water flow, taking advantage, of course, of the natural rock. He was brilliant at laying out rocks, had a spectacular eye. You can imagine this is before the days of backhoes. This was all done with literally horses, mules, carts, and they all arranged all these rocks by hand. And that was a few years after it opened, 1937. You can see the big black oak that remains there, that was preserved. You can see the woodland edge, it's really just the forest over there. So he even preserved the nature of the site while building this amazing multi-layered garden. And that's the garden maybe 15 years ago. You can see the black oak is still there. Unfortunately, that black oak had to be removed probably about 10 years ago. But there's still extraordinary native trees that create the kind of frame around this garden, the context for this garden. And it is quite beautiful. And it's very much a spring garden, again, from mid-April to the beginning of June. But because of the brilliant rock work and because of its sensitive relationship to the rest of the land, it's also a pretty amazing space to visit in any season. Some more shots that Larry took looking up through the stream. The stream used to be basically an open tap, just like all of Central Park water features are open taps. Again, not throwing shade at Central Park, but it's a fact. About 10 years ago, we reworked this, and these are basically water, they're recirculating. There's a pool at the bottom of the rock garden, and we have pumps, and that water recirculates around and around, because we don't want to just keep an open tap, not very sustainable. Even the cascade, again, is fed by this recirculating system. We did rebuild this cascade, again, about 12 years ago, but the rock garden is all original, and we have these wonderful historic photographs that we use to guide the reconstruction of that. Again, even in the middle of winter, when not much going on, it really is a beautiful and elegant garden that sits so nicely in the landscape, and in contrast to that set of gardens that I showed you, top of Daffodil Hill, which ultimately, of course, disappeared, because it just didn't fit. Okay, the next garden, and this is a more modern garden, this is the azalea garden, which opened in 2011. And this is, again, based on this long history of the institution, we are Museum of Plants. We've always grown diverse collections of shrubs. Originally, they were laid out in what's called the Fruitacetum, the shrub collection. That's the picture on the left. And then we did some big rhododendron plantings around Twin Lakes in 1910, around the right. So this was this land before the garden took it over, in an open field. It was okay, but not super inspiring. And this is the land that was part of the original garden in 1895, but that we lost in 1937. So I told you that we added 150 acres in 1915 to make the garden 400 acres, but then we again lost 150 acres in 1937, so we're back down to 250 acres. Unfortunately, some of the land that we lost was the original, part of the original garden, not the forest, but some of the original collections. So we were left without some of these historic collections, which is kind of wonderful, because we could figure out a way to do this in a modern way. So in the 1960s, they started planting azaleas in the shade of some of these native shade trees outside of the forest. This is adjacent to the forest, but not in the forest. Nice enough. But there were some awkward paths. The paths were very steep. They went at right angles to the topography. You couldn't really get in to see the azaleas. And it was just kind of azaleas, a ground cover of weeds, and these great old trees. So when we had the opportunity to reconceive the azalea garden, we really conceived it as a botanical garden in miniature. We wanted to have the greatest diversity of plants that we could possibly grow in one location. We wanted it to be beautiful. We wanted the plants that we chose to be aligned with the qualities of the site. So we worked with the landscape architects in Sweden to come up with their kind of classic, large, sweeping combinations of plants. We did so in a way preserving as many of the trees as possible, just as we did, as the garden did in the 1890s. We lay out the paths to avoid the existing trees. Azaleas need high shade. We had the high shade from native trees. We would be very careful to not damage those trees in making this garden. And we decided that we would have many layers of plants across the landscape. So the resulting garden is quite amazing. If you like azaleas, I would suggest coming in the first week of May, give or take. We designed what we call the Mother's Day slope to peak around Mother's Day. I, for one, I get a little bit itchy when I see too much pastel in the same place at the same time. I prefer the garden in the dead of winter because you really read the way the landscape works. But it is beautiful, and you can see there are many, many layers of plants. It takes advantage of the mature trees that create the canopy. You see the azaleas in full flower, but there's also clethra and ferns and epimedium and hosta, just a remarkable diversity of plants, all chosen because they are adapted to those conditions in that site. High shade, where the soil is moist, we plant moisture-loving plants. The soil is dry, we plant plants that can handle dry shade, et cetera, et cetera. Many, many layers, very legible, very beautiful, and again, multi-seasonal. And again, my favorite time in the garden is in the winter. We have our collection of witch hazels there, and you can really read the way it relates to the landscape in the winter in ways that are hard to do when all the trees are leafed out. Quite amazing. Then there's the native plant garden, which opened in 2013. And obviously, those of you who are interested in gardening with nature know that native plants is the shortest path to doing good in a garden. And I wholeheartedly encourage the planting of native plants. It's a really, really rewarding pastime. Because A, they're beautiful, B, they actually serve local wildlife pollinators, and C, you learn about them. And so now all of a sudden you have a better connection with the world that you inhabit. And those are all reasons to grow native plants. But as you've seen across NYBG, we have the native forest, all native plants except for the invasives, and we have native plantings, but we also plant the plants of the world. And as a gardener, you should always feel like you can do that. Douglas Ptolemy says you plant basically 2/3 of the birds, or about 66% of the plants are native. You can make a real difference ecologically. That's wonderful, but start small. Plant one native oak, and you're doing a lot for your society and for your ecology, and I promise you, you'll get hooked and plant more. But our native plant garden is about native plants on a blown out scale. Again, there's a history. Remember I talked about Elizabeth Britton, who noticed that the wildflowers were disappearing in the forest, and that really inspired her to become a conservationist. She helped co-found the Wildflower Preservation Society of America, and then she devoted the rest of her career to promoting the use of native wildflowers in gardens. And she was an amazing person and got, of course, no credit until almost very recently. Way ahead of her time, a brilliant scientist on her own right. She was a moss expert, but again, an early and ardent advocate for the preservation and use of native plants. So the original native plant garden was just basically a copse of trees and some rocks next to the rock garden, with a plaque stuck in it in her memory. And it was a place where birds would come and butterflies would come, so it kind of worked as native plants. And then they get a little complicated. Those of you who've been around the garden for a long time, it was my favorite part of the NYBG when I started, but it was a series of kind of ersatz ecosystems, like a little miniature pine barrens and a little miniature serpentine barren, and so on and so forth. So they all kind of echoed something that happened in nature, but they were all artificial and kind of stacked on top of each other. It was impossible to read aesthetically, and it was impossible to maintain horticulturally. It was really actually a failure. If the goal was to promote the use of native plants, the only people who were inspired by that garden to do so were people who were going to use them anyway, and just wanted to know what they looked like. And this is what it ended up looking like. You know, it was more lawn than garden. You can see the edge of the old pine barrens. Again, there were great plants kind of tucked in here or there, but you had to work hard to find them. It was a nightmare to take care of, right? So not a great advertisement for native plants. If we want to convince people to use them, this is not doing the trick. So again, we worked with Van Sweden to reconceive the whole space. And what we decided was we didn't want to create a bunch of ersatz ecosystems because that already is an input that the average person can't do. Instead, we wanted to follow the first principle of good garden design, is design the garden for the site you have, not the site you wished you had. And if there's any kind of ethos that connects all the work we've done at NYBG, we have always gardened with the site we have, which is part of the reason why the garden is such a magical place today. So they created a series of areas based on what was there. That would be old lawn, became a meadow. That's what it looked like before we started. Again, there's split rock, which is a glacial erotic and sounds nice. We did expand the garden a little bit. That split rock used to be outside of the garden. It's now inside the native plant garden. You can see there's an old drainage ditch down the middle. More about that. So that's the canvas. You plant a lot of plants. This was right before Hurricane Irene, which is in September of 2011. And I won't go deep into the technique here. There's a lot of work, and only half the plants washed away the next day, so we had to replant all these plants. And then you created this remarkable space. Interesting aside, this meadow, again, the garden opened in 2013. We did the initial planting in 2011. It's been choked by mugwort, and so we are actually innovating ways to manage mugwort. More about that in my next presentation. There was an old woodland garden, not very, it was unprepossessing. It didn't look much good garden. You couldn't tell the difference between it and the adjacent forest. Again, we plant a lot of plants in intentional arrangement. You can see the forest just beyond. This fence is the delineation between the native plant garden and the forest. And then you have these wonderful, rich, multi-layered plantings that are beautiful throughout the year. How about a water feature? I went back and forth with the president of the garden at the time. He is in love with Italian gardens. Ninfa is a garden outside of Rome that I've never been to, but I've seen lots of pictures of. Water feature is a really key component of that garden, as it is many Roman gardens. And ultimately, he thought it would be a good idea to have a water feature in the middle of the space, which was a brilliant idea. Because what was a drainage ditch connected to the open tap that was feeding the rock garden cascade ultimately. Now this is naturally a low point, so it would become moist in the normal spring, but it would dry out in winter. Well, we thought that might be good as a recirculating water feature. And what this water feature does is that it gives you the sound of running water and falling water, which is lovely. It gives you the reflection of the sky, which is amazing. It gives you habitat for aquatic plants. And it also gives your eye a place to rest, because the native plant garden is a very busy space. There's lots of plants jammed together. So think of it as like a reverse frame. The painting is around the frame rather than the other way around, and it's necessary to give the garden structure and context. Again, a garden beautiful throughout the year. Particularly, I love it in winter. You realize the structure, and we designed a lot of the plantings that they would be beautiful in winter. And the idea here was originally, I thought it would be to take native plant gardens from the realm of those who wear Birkenstocks, and then you give it to the realm of those who wear wellies. Of course, my daughter is now 18, as like a hip 14-year-old wearing Birkenstocks, so it doesn't make any sense anymore. The idea wasn't, you shouldn't be guilted into using native plants in your garden. You should be inspired to use them in your garden. And we want this garden to inspire people to do it, not convince them to do it. Okay, and the last little section is just a little bit of a tribute to, again, the founders and their vision to preserve the trees across the landscape. And again, maybe the best thing each of us can do as gardeners, if you are lucky enough to have an oak tree or a big old sugar maple or a hickory, God, if you have a hickory, I'm so jealous, they're amazing trees, is just take care of them. Because those trees are engines for ecology in our part of the world, and they're beautiful, and they're relevant, and they're of the place. And again, the garden's founders recognize that. Preserve the forest in its entirety, and as many of its big old trees as they could across the landscape. And again, we today, 130 years later, are the beneficiaries of that vision. We have about, outside of the forest, we've got 5,000 trees in our collection. The tallest tree is about 160 feet tall, a tulip tree. The largest tree in terms of stem diameter is also a tulip tree. It's a mother tree in one of the library building, almost 6 feet across. And I estimate in the collections we have more than 1,000 trees that are a century old. There's probably a much higher number than that. It's an amazing place to see trees. Across the entire landscape, like this big old black oak, like this younger red oak in Daffodil Valley, and other daffodil plantings that I didn't have time to talk about, but different than Daffodil Hill, and lovely for its own reasons. And oak in our oak collections. All of these trees are older than the garden itself. All of these trees are things that were preserved and have created a framework for the building of the garden, and that we have preserved as we have restored the garden. An amazing red oak near the library building. And so, you know, again, if I could give any advice, is if you plant carefree trees, because one big old oak tree supports, according to Doug Calamy, up more than 500 lepidopteras, with butterflies and moth species, prevents about 6,000 gallons of stormwater from entering the stormwater system in a year, stores about 15,000 pounds of carbon, and is constantly removing, scrubbing the air of air pollution, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and ozone. They are remarkable. And Ridgefield, those of you who live there, in Wilton and Reading and surrounding towns, has just the most amazing trees. It really does, and we all have the responsibility to do what we can to take care of them, particularly if they're on our own properties. So ultimately, I end with the best advice that I can give if you are interested in gardening with nature. Not all of us are blessed to have a landscape with a 50-acre outdoor forest and thousands of ancient trees, and then teams of horticulturists to take care of all of the above, and millions of dollars to invest over a long period of time. But if you have a garden, you have the capacity to improve the world, quite frankly. And you start off by doing no harm. Don't overwater, don't over-fertilize, don't overspray. Recognize that your garden is connected to the larger landscape. You are in a watershed. In Ridgefield, Mark, it's maybe 7 rivers emanate, start in Ridgefield. It's amazing. So what you put in your garden ends up in Long Island Sound. And why would you do that if you don't have to? It's expensive, it's unnecessary, it's damaging. Don't plant non-invasives. You might love bittersweet. I don't think anybody here loves bittersweet. It's beautiful. But there are lots, and unfortunately more and more plants are becoming clear to be invasive or damaging. And it's a bummer. But I look at it the other way. And we've done a little bit of an analysis, looking at things that have become established in the forest. So overall, this is just looking at trees and shrubs, woody plants. Over all the thousands of species that we planted over 130 years, fewer than 10% have actually become at all invasive or established in the forest, which means that you have roughly 90% of the options out there to choose from. Why would you ever, during that, plant something that was going to possibly damage nature? And then once you get the hang of doing no harm, then you have the capacity to garden for the greater good, right? So planting natives, again, you don't have to go crazy. If you want to, please do. But just start to incorporate them into the mix. And I promise you, you will appreciate them for their beauty and their utility in the garden. Be conscious about creating habitat for other things that want to be in your garden. And again, as I said, plant trees and take care of them when you have them. And then ultimately, then when you're completely hooked, you've drank the Kool-Aid, you're ready to go. There's so many local and regional organizations that are doing work in our natural areas. Ridgefield has amazing natural areas, and those natural areas need a lot of help. I guess the take-home message for me in nature is that we have broken it, so we have bought it. So anything that any of us can do to help improve it, manually, mechanically, through supporting institutions and organizations, is a good thing. Because ultimately, I think the rest of the world is going to wake up one day and realize that the only way that we have, I think, as bright a future as we have had a past, is that if we get committed to taking care of the world that sustains us. And nobody is better qualified or should do that than a thoughtful gardener. And that is it. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm even happier to have you all watch the document about the book tomorrow.
Do you guys get thin the forest?
We don't. So
Underbrush, none of that stuff?
well, we thin it by removing invasive species. So if you couldn't hear, Mark asked if we have to thin the forest. Thinning the forest is something that silviculturists do, people who tend forests to increase yield of whatever it is, veneer wood or or pulp. Basically, because our landscape, because the forest is multi-aged, it's not like a second growth forest or third growth forest. Nature does a thinning forest. It's rocky, trees fall down, it creates openings, things come in, they compete with each other, and all of what you see there is that forest growing on its own. It's hard to, the only way that you can see the work that we do is if you recognize species, and you'd be like, wow, there really aren't that, I don't see any berberis. I don't really see any burning bush. I see a lot of actual vegetation on the ground. I don't see much. But your eye would not pick up like the intent of it. So no, we don't come to both. Any other questions? Yes.
What led to the loss of the acres that you referred to earlier, the 100 or so acres?
That's a great question. Stephen asked why did we go from 400 back to 250 acres, and it was the expansion of the Bronx River Parkway. Thank you, Robert Moses. Yeah. Which interesting is that, as you can tell, I've done a lot of research to write the book, and just being, I don't think that you can be an effective steward of a piece of land until you understand its history. And I don't just say that because the chair of the Historical Society is asking that question. It's just true. And so I've always been a student of the history of the places where I work, but of course I've worked in the garden for a long time. And so I went back to see, like, where was the outrage? There was no outrage. There might have been some raised eyebrows and some stern words in board meetings. I didn't read those minutes. But I know in my heart of hearts, they couldn't take care of 100 acres. It's hard enough to take care of 250 acres. My guess is that T.H. Everett was like, as long as oh, that's terrible. It's a lot to take care of. It's mostly underneath what is down the Bronx River. Any other questions? Yes.
You said you keep the deer off, but what about woodchucks and rabbits and all these other fun things that we smaller birds?
Yeah, so fortunately, woodchucks or gophers are not a big problem for NYBG, but they are a problem for me in Ridgefield. I can give you some hints off the record for dealing with those. We have, because we have such natural diversity, we have our wood mice populations are off the charts. Our vole populations are off the charts. Our squirrel populations are 5 to 7 times what you expect, which is actually a problem because they eat most of the acorns and most of the tree nuts that fall. And we also have wonderful populations of owls and red-tailed hawks, and the coyotes have been coming through and staying. And so I'm not, but things come and other things eat them. And we're great. Any other questions? Well, you guys have been awesome. Thank you all for spending Wednesday evenings. I really appreciate it.